Welcome everyone. Through the day today, you've seen a number of images presented, mostly of the sun. And hopefully in the course of this presentation, I will show you how you could get pictures like that for yourself using techniques for solar system imaging. So I'd like to start with a little bit of history of my own experience with imaging the solar system. In the beginning, these are the sort of results that I was getting. And this is back almost 10 years ago now when I first started trying to capture pictures of solar system objects. And these were all done with a security camera that I rigged up to my telescope and to capture single frames from the video stream. So not really too complex in my methodology, but still getting reasonable results. And then as I learned more about what other people are doing to improve the quality of their images, my images also improved. So you can see I was able to get finer detail on the moon. I was able to get nice detail on the sun, the sunspots there on the right. And I also had some not too bad success getting images of the planets. So this is on the order of 5 years ago, say. And now today, this is sort of where I'm at. I've come up with my own sort of process of doing things. Most of what I've done has been dedicated to the moon. It's one of the most fascinating targets for me. So a lot of what I've done to my methods have been in the interest of improving my moon images, but also I've spent quite a bit of time imaging the sun. The planets are still a topic that I'm working on. They are, I think, more challenging than the sun or the moon, because you have to deal a lot more with the seeing conditions of your location. It makes it much more challenging. So why do we do solar system imaging? Well, for me personally, I find it equally challenging, a challenging pursuit, but also equally so rewarding. As I mentioned, the first attempt at taking solar system images was about 10 years ago. And since then, I've continued to pick up techniques from other people and even from trial and error, improve the way I do things. And my intention is to pass as much of this knowledge on to you over the course of the next, say, 50 minutes or so. If you want to ask questions, you can go ahead and ask throughout the presentation. I don't mind. So first we'll talk about what exactly is solar system imaging. I'm going to talk about a technique called lucky imaging, which is the main technique used by imagers. I'll go over quickly what sort of equipment you need, the computing resources you need, and then I will give you some tips and tricks on how to improve your results, including a live demonstration of using the software to get your final results. So what is solar system imaging? So solar system imaging is trying to take a picture of anything that's within our own solar system. So that would include the sun, the moon, and the planets. Now, technically, comets and asteroids are also in our solar system, but the techniques you would use for them is quite a bit different, mostly because they're much dimmer than the other objects in our solar system. So all these objects are bright enough to keep your exposure times very, very short. So on the order of 1/10 of a second down to 1/10,000th of a second, which is typical what I use on the sun. The magnifications are also typically high for astronomical imaging. I'm working with focal lengths that range from 600 all the way up to 8,000 millimeters. And some people even go longer than that. One aspect that people don't really think about trying to image objects in space is that solar system objects actually change in appearance within the time scale of capturing the data. They're rotating, they're moving in their orbits, and in the case of the sun, they can actually be physically changing their appearance within the matter of minutes that you're trying to record your image data. So that's something that you need to take into account when you're doing your imaging. So the main challenge to imaging is the Earth's atmosphere. As we know today, cloud cover is obviously a big problem. If it's cloudy or partly cloudy even, it pretty much puts an end to any attempts to image. Transparency. So in addition to cloud cover, there can be particulates in the atmosphere, whether it's water vapor, dust, or aerosols. All these things can affect how clear and how sharp the detail is in the object you're trying to image. And then the seeing, which we've talked quite a bit about today. If you were on earlier when we had the live view of the sun, you would have seen how the image was dancing around as a result of movement of the atmosphere. So that is a big part of our problem. Another effect that we don't often talk about is something called dispersion. So the Earth's atmosphere acts just like a big lens. So as light travels through the atmosphere, it diffracts slightly, just like light going through the lens in a telescope. And it bends and changes the direction of the light differently depending on what wavelength it is. So as a result, you can get red-blue halos on objects. And this is especially true if the object is really low in the sky, very close to the horizon, which is unfortunately typically the case in Canada, where our latitude is so high north that most of the planets are low in the sky when we try to image them. And also if you are using a high magnification, it amplifies this effect. So that's another thing that we need to deal with. So continuing with the Earth's atmosphere, all of those effects are worse the lower in the sky the object is. So the higher the object is in the sky, the better it is for your end results. So the other thing that's a challenge is dealing with the time aspect. So as I mentioned, the targets that we're looking at are changing in time, like the planets are rotating, and you can see the change over the course of minutes. Jupiter is a good example of that. It rotates fairly quickly. The shadows on the moon, they're changing with time as it's going around in its orbit. And then you have things moving around because of the seeing. So if you try to use a long exposure, you're going to blur more of the detail due to the seeing. So the objective is to get your data as quickly as possible to minimize these effects. And so that points you in the direction of using a camera and a telescope combination that allows you to keep your exposure times low and the rate that you're collecting data, or the frame rate, keeping it high. So here's an example. This is a video that I captured many years ago now, and it's typical of what you would see looking through a telescope. And the camera picks up exactly the same view as what your eye sees. So it captures all this shimmering due to the seeing. Now you may note that, I'll start it again. Especially if you focus on the younger sharp-rimmed crater at the top. Some of the time it's clear, some of the times it's not. And similar for other parts of the image. Sometimes a part of the image is clear and other times it's not. And that is something that we can use going forward, and I'll explain how. So just to wrap up some of the challenges. So the atmospheric effects, very clearly, they take away from the quality of the image, but they're only generally making parts of the image blurry at one time. When you're using your eye to do the observing, our brain has been, the brain-eye system has been designed to deal with issues like this. It's able to average frames, if you will, automatically. So we can see or perceive more detail with our eye than the camera does. The camera doesn't lie. It collects the data as the data looks, and it's up to us to process it after the fact. So for imaging, the best way to do this is to collect a whole bunch of images, like thousands and thousands of images, and then from them pick out the best ones to combine together into a single image. And this is the essence of lucky imaging. So the steps involved in lucky imaging is first collect a whole bunch of images. If you just want to experiment, you can start out with a couple of hundred frames. But me, on a normal day, would collect 2,000 to 3,000 frames of whatever it is that I'm imaging for processing later. From those frames, you pick out the best ones based on how clear they look or how distorted they are from the seeing. The best of all of those you're going to use as a reference that you're going to compare all the other frames to. By comparing all of the frames to that reference frame and ranking them in terms of quality, you can then decide which ones you want to keep, which ones you want to throw away. The ones that are the best, we align them to each other and stack them, which is sort of an averaging process to result in one image. This sounds complicated, but luckily there is software that does all of that for you automatically. All you need to do is collect the data at the start. And I will demonstrate an example of one of these softwares a little bit later. So, does it work? Yes, it does. This is a single frame from a video I took of the sun using a calcium K setup from a couple of years ago, I believe. And you can see it's quite blurry. So there's, you can tell that this is a series of sunspots. You can tell that there is bright plages that are interconnecting the sunspots, but you can't really see a lot of fine detail. So when you take, say, 1,000 frames like this, pick the best 100 and stack them together in the software, you get something like this. Or actually, I guess it was the best 250 out of 3,000. You get something like this. So you can see already that mostly in the plages, the white areas in between, that a lot more detail is visible. So like in here, the detail in these areas are much better defined. Now, if you go another step, which is called wavelets, which is a sharpening process, you get to a final product that looks like this. So starting with a frame that looks like this from a video, you can get to this. So the process does work. It's amazing, actually, sometimes what you can pull out of really messy data. So I'm going to put lucky imaging aside for a sec and talk a little bit now about the equipment that you need to take your own solar system images. Starting with your telescope and mount. So the type of telescope you use is actually quite flexible. The main thing is that you want to have a decent focal length, so something in the 500 to 2000 range. That's a good place to start. You probably want to have an extra device called a Barlow, also called a teleextender, which is just a piece of optics that you put between your camera and the telescope to increase the focal length of your telescope. And they usually come in factors, so like a 2 times or a 3 times. So a 2 times would increase the focal length of your scope by a factor of 2, etc. So it's good to have one of those. You want to have a telescope with a good fine focus. The focusing is an important part of this process because the details you're trying to capture are very small, typically. So you want to be able to get really fine focus, and that means having a good focuser on the scope in question. And you need to have some sort of tracking to be able to capture the number of frames needed to get good images. You're not going to be able to do that with a push-pull type setup. You're going to need a mount that's motorized, that's able to track the target. Equatorial mount is best, but you can also have good results with Alt-Az type mounts as well. So continuing about telescopes and mounts, here are some of the scopes that I use. So for solar, so like what I use today, I use typically my 98mm refractor for any white light imaging, and that includes calcium K, like I did today. And for hydrogen alpha, I use a smaller refractor. It's about a 2.5-inch refractor. I use them because those particular filters only work properly with refractors. Anything bigger than that, like a reflector, and it's too much light for the filter to handle. So there's a bit of a limitation there. But also those particular scopes give nice sharp views. So I'm quite pleased with the results I get with those 2 refractors. For lunar, I use the 10-inch Ritchie-Chrétien. And I can quickly flip back over to here. I just stop share for a sec. Now just refresh everybody's memory with those 3 telescopes. So the larger white and gold one, that's the 4-inch refractor with the Herschel wedge, and it has a calcium K filter on it. The smaller white one is the 2.5-inch refractor that has the hydrogen alpha tunable etalon on it, and then the larger black one is the 10-inch Ritchie-Chrétien that I use for lunar. And that's my main setup now. So I will flip back now. For planets, I also use the 10-inch RC strictly because to get a decent size image of the planet, you need quite a bit of magnification. So the RC has the longest focal length of those 3 scopes. I do have a couple of different size Barlows that I use. The 2 times is the one that I would use the most. The 4 times, rarely will I ever use it because the seeing in the Ottawa area is typically not that great, and you really need to have excellent seeing conditions to be able to magnify the image that much. So the mount I use, you also saw in that photo, is a German equatorial. And in this particular case, it's a Skywatcher brand EQ8. So of cameras, you have quite a lot of choices, to be frank. Any camera that will allow you to record video or a sequence of images will do the job. There's a lot of varieties available to fit your budget. You can use a cheap used webcam that you bought off of Kijiji, or you can go crazy and get yourself an astrophotography dedicated camera that is in the 10K range, but I advise you don't need to do that. You can get excellent results with a much more affordable camera. The best results will come with a camera that has a high sensitivity and a fast frame rate. Now, you do have a choice between using a monochrome camera or using a color camera. I tend to use monochrome more because the cameras are more sensitive and they give you a much better resolution. Now, sometimes when I'm imaging planets and I want to have a full color image, I will use a color camera just because there isn't a bunch of processing to do after you collect the image. You get a color image right out of the can. So as I mentioned, the cheapest way to get into solar system imaging is to use a webcam. You can buy these new or used in the $5 to $30 range. They're easy to use. The problem is they have a pretty low sensitivity, so you're only going to be able to use them on the brightest of objects. Next up in price is to use a security camera, and you can buy these off of a number of websites online for relatively low cost. Their sensitivity is better than the webcams, but they are typically low resolution. They're normally all like standard definition video, so a fairly low resolution, but they have a good sensitivity typically. Next up from that would be cameras purpose-built for astro videography. They have good sensitivity as well, but they are similar resolution to security cameras. So next up in the similar price to the astro video cameras are cameras that are purpose-made for solar system imaging. These have both good sensitivity and a fast refresh rate. And that's what I use currently. If you have a DSLR, you can also use that. It's a multi-purpose camera, and most of the modern ones are able to take video that you can save as a file and then process after. And then finally, like I said, if you wanted to spend the money, you could get a purpose-made astrophotography camera, which has good sensitivity, but they aren't typically made for capturing frames at a fast rate. So they're not really the best choice for this application. You'd be much better off to save your money and get yourself a planetary camera. So moving on to computer and software. So you do need to have a reasonably powerful computer because you're going to be dealing with a large amount of video. And manipulating video can be a pretty computationally intensive task for your computer. So you want something reasonably powerful. Multiprocessor, more than 4 gigs of RAM, and a large hard drive are all recommended for your PC. When I say large hard drive, I mean on the order of 1 terabyte or more. The operating system isn't really important, but you'll find that most of the software that's available today is for Windows. The camera type that you've chosen will have an impact on how much computing resources you need. If you're using a webcam, then you could probably get away with a very basic computer because the size of the video files are quite small. But if you have an astrophotography camera or even a DSLR, your video files are going to be quite large in size, and you're going to need a more powerful computer to work on those files. To capture the video, if you're capturing it directly to a computer, you have a number of choices, lots of free software out there. There's something called Virtual Dub, AMCAP. I use Fire Capture myself for all my planetary imaging. It's free software. And SharpCap also has the capability of collecting planetary imaging. There's a free version of it as well you can download. For alignment and stacking, there are 2 main programs that I work with. I think there's 1 or 2 other ones, but the 2 main ones are Registax, which is sort of come to an end of its development at version 6.1. I haven't heard of it having a newer version than that. And then AUTOSTAKKER 3 is the latest version. These are also free softwares that you can download off the internet. After you've done your stacking, it helps to do a little bit of extra photo editing to really jazz up your image and do cropping and rotating, that sort of thing. And you can use whatever image editing software you like to use. It doesn't really matter. So coming back now into the techniques. We're doing pretty good, actually. I'm on till, what time? 7:30?
7:15, I believe.
7:15? Okay, yeah, we should be good. So capturing your data, the most important thing probably is focus, getting a good focus. So the thing to start with is to allow your scope plenty of time to cool down, especially if you're using a reflecting type telescope. So I leave at least 30 minutes, an hour would be better. And the idea is to get the optics and the air in the tube all at a uniform temperature so that you don't get tube currents like Attila was talking about earlier this afternoon. Take your sweet time focusing. I can't emphasize that enough. It's really important to get the focus right. It can be off even just a little bit, and it will have a big impact on your results. So don't feel like you're in a hurry. Just take your time to get it where you want it. Unfortunately, if your seeing is not great, it can make your focusing a challenge because your image is going to be dancing around and it's hard to pick a feature to use as your reference for when you're focusing. So again, you need to sort of take your time. Now you do have some choices with the filters that you can use. You can go without filters, but you'll find you'll get much better results if you do use a filter. They can help to sharpen your focus and to improve your contrast. At the very least, I recommend that you use a UV IR cut filter. this will limit what your camera sees to just what's in the visual band, and that'll help with the focus. If you're looking for color images, you can use something called a moon and sky glow filter. That's what I use when I'm imaging, say, Jupiter or Mars. It helps to improve the brilliance of the color, and it improves the contrast, I find. And the version I use by Bader Planetarium has a IR UV cut built in.
While you pause, Jim, it's Chris, and I just want to interject with a clarification. Your slot goes till 7:30.
It does till 7:30?
Yeah, 7:30, correct.
Okay, good. Thank you. Now, for the moon, which, as I mentioned, is my main interest in solar system imaging, I use an IR pass filter almost exclusively. But a red filter or even a hydrogen alpha filter that you would use for deep sky imaging works as well. And the idea is to only use light of longer wavelength that is less affected by the seeing conditions. I didn't show today, but there is another filter available for doing white light solar imaging. You can use it for visual as well, but it's really effective for imaging, and that's called a solar continuum filter. It's a filter in the green part of the spectrum, and it does a good job of improving the contrast and focus as well. So if you are really trying to improve your results and you're pushing up against things like the dispersion, there is a way of dealing with it. I don't typically deal with it unless I'm doing planetary imaging, where I'm zoomed in to 4,000 millimeters focal length. It helps quite a lot if you use a narrow bandpass filter. If you're only letting a small part of the spectrum through, then the fact that the other wavelengths of light are not being bent by the atmosphere the same doesn't matter, because you're just blocking them anyway. There is also a gadget available called the dispersion reduction device that allows you to, using prisms, to correct for the dispersion in the atmosphere. It's a little tricky to use. I have one, and I've used it a few times, and it does work fairly well. They used to be really expensive, but now they're not too bad. They're kind of in the $100 range now. Earlier today, when Simon was doing his solar observing, he may have seen Newton's rings in his image, and he talked about how they are created. It's an optical effect. It's common in hydrogen alpha solar imaging, but it's also whenever you have very, very narrow wavelength light, you can see this effect. You see it as alternating dark and light bands. And it's a result of the image plane, so the sensor in the camera, and the focus plane of the scope not being perfectly parallel. So there is also a gadget for fixing that. All it does is very finely adjusts the tilt of the camera. And again, those used to be very expensive, but now I think they're not too bad. They're kind of also in the $150 range. I mentioned previously Barlow's. I do recommend having at least one, probably a 2 times is handy to have. It allows you, if your seeing is good, to get better resolution in whatever it is you're imaging. To demonstrate that idea, the idea of resolution, I have a couple of images taken here with different camera and Barlow configurations. So this is a image using quite a small, low resolution sensor with no Barlow. This is a picture of the sun. And it's, I think it was standard definition. So like 640 by 480 pixels in size. And then the same setup, I switched cameras to a larger sensor with smaller pixels, so more resolution to get this. So you can see how much finer the detail is we can see. And then on that setup, I put a 2 times Barlow to produce an image like this. Now you can actually see I do have Newton's rings in this image. You can see the banding that's occurring. There's like a light band there, there, and there. So there is an advantage to improving the resolution of your imaging, whether you're using a Barlow or using a camera that has smaller pixels. So the next thing to think about when you're doing your data capture is the exposure time of your camera. So there's a balance to be made between how much time it takes for each frame to expose and how much gain you're using from the camera. Gain is like an amplification that happens in the electronics of the camera. You can apply more gain, but it ends up also amplifying the noise of the image. So you don't want to go with too much gain because your image will be too noisy, but then you don't want too short, too long an exposure, because then the effects of the seeing get too large. So my target is to get 1,000 to 2,000 frames in about a minute. So you want to have a camera that can give you the desired exposure, but also give you those frames quickly enough to give you that many frames in about a minute. And the minute time limit is based on how quickly the target is changing that you're trying to image. I try to adjust the exposure so the image is a little on the flat side, so you're not clipping anything on the black end or on the white end of the image. That way you know all of the image data is captured in your video. You can always adjust your histogram after. And if you're using a color camera, I recommend that you get your white balance as close as you can at the start before you capture the data, because adjusting white balance after the fact is can be challenging. If the software you're using to capture your data has a live histogram, and a histogram is a graph that shows you the distribution of light and dark in your image, definitely use that as a tool for setting your exposure. It can tell you very clearly that you're not losing any information on the light end or the dark end of the image. The video file, if you're recording to an AVI, which is a default Windows video file format, make sure that it's uncompressed. If you use a compressed format, it loses data. It's a lossy format, so make sure it's uncompressed. Problem with that is the files will be really large. Alternatively, you can just save it as a big series of images. The software doesn't care if it's images or if it's a video file. Be prepared for lots and lots of data. To give you an example, on a typical night of observing, say, the moon, I'll capture about 200 gigabytes of data. that's typical.
Jim?
Yeah.
We'll have about 15 minutes. We've got a couple of questions, so let me know when you want to answer them.
Well, we can answer them right now if we want, before I move on to demonstrating AUTOSTAKKER.
So the first question is, these are really wonderful slides. This is from Tom. Will these wonderful slides I've been seeing today be available later?
Yes, my plan is to get a copy of everybody's presentation from today and post them to the Astro Day Ottawa website. So they will be available for download after today.
Great.
And Jim, it's Chris intervening with a second half answer to that.
Mm-hmm.
Throughout today, we have been live streaming to YouTube. And as each live stream session, morning, afternoon, and evening finishes, they are converted into video that remain on the RASC Ottawa Centre YouTube channel. So anyone can go back and rewatch any or all of today's sessions.
That's great, eh? Wow.
That's great.
And Jim, second question from Phil. Can you get rid of those bands you're showing on your solar image via Photoshop?
Extremely difficult to do. You would have to be able to take a flat frame, which is not impossible, just really challenging using a solar scope, because you have to find a uniformly illuminated target to point your scope at to be able to get a flat frame. A flat frame records all those variations in brightness of the image due to the optics. This is a common thing to do with astrophotography. And you could do it with this problem with the Newton's rings, but finding a good uniform background to take your frame with, it's really challenging. I've tried to do it for another reason. I had another weird camera problem that I was trying to deal with, but finding something bright enough to point your solar scope at so that you get illuminated uniform image to take your flat with is really challenging. So the best way to deal with it is to get rid of it in the first place by getting one of these camera tilters.
That's all the questions we have for now. So
okay. So instead of reading through this list, my intention is to actually demonstrate how this process works. So I am going to escape this down there. Start up AUTOSTAKKER. I think I'm going to have to share my whole desktop though for this to work. Can I do that? Share screen. There, can you see my desktop?
Yes, I could.
yes.
Okay. So I'm going to open up something that I recorded a while ago, but it is a good example of what how the process works. Planet imaging. There we go. So this is a short video sequence of the sun in calcium K. I can slide around through the frames here. You can kind of see what it looks like. So it was a average day. So this is called AUTOSTAKKER 3. It's a free software written by a European. I think he's German. And it is still being actively developed. He's still around. You can message this guy. And it's used by a lot of people around the world. So there's lots of forums that you can get pointers on how to use it. So I don't use all of the features. I'm sort of a novice user still, but I'm happy with the results I get from it. So when you start it up, you get two windows, the control window and the video display window. You start by clicking the open button, and you navigate to your file and open it up. And you start by doing something called the image stabilization analysis. So the software is going to go through all the frames in the video to figure out how much the image is moving around, the quality of the images, and decide which ones are the best. So we have a choice between surface and planet. This is I would call a surface. I'd use planet if it was like you see the whole disk of the object in the image, but in this case we only see a part of the sun, so we'll use surface. And I use the control left click to move this green box around. This is the box that it's going to use. It's going to find all of these features inside this box and track them through all of the frames of the video to figure out how well aligned the frames are, and also to choose the quality of each of the frames. So once I've placed it where I want, I click the Analyze button, and it'll chug away. When it's done, it shows me this graph. I'll get my annotate tools here. Gives me a graph showing the relative quality of all my frames. Actually, it's not very good. There's very few frames that are above 75% quality. So this wasn't a very good day, apparently. It also displays in the display window the best frame that it found out of all the frames. So this is what it is recommending I use as the reference frame. If I'm happy with that, if I'm happy with its choice, then I go down here to the alignment points window here, and I put points on the image that I want the software to use to align one frame to the next. So it's not just going to take the images and move them around until they're right on top of each other. It's actually going to take a feature that it finds in one frame and move it to line up with the same feature in the next frame, and do that for all of the points that I put on the image. So if I say, right now it's defaulting to a size of 48. So if I do that, it's now just placed just over 2,000 points on the image. And when I say go, it's going to, for every one of these points, find that feature in every single frame that's near that point and jiggle it around until it's aligned in all of the frames. It's quite fascinating and very complicated. I'm happy somebody else did this for us already. So once I am happy with my points, actually I might add a few more. You can manually add points if you want to add some more. It's like around these sunspots, might add a few more alignment points to make sure that the sunspots get aligned nicely. Once I'm done with that, I go back to the main control window, and I look at my stack options. So right now, I can choose the number of frames to stack, or I can choose the frame percentage to stack. So the original video was 100 frames. I'm going to choose to stack 10%. And I'm going to hit stack, and away it goes. There's a number of other features there I don't typically use. There's something called drizzle, which is it will scale the images up by a factor and then stack to stack those, and it gives you kind of a false pretend adding a Barlow kind of done digitally. I don't typically use it. You're better to just actually add a Barlow. So let's go see if I can find what it did. Here we are. So here is the result of the stack. So you can see it actually did a pretty nice job of sharpening up the detail around the sunspots, especially the plages that surround it. So that was from stacking 10% of 100 frames. So that relatively simple process. The software makes it really, really easy. I'm going to go back now to here. And let's see if this works. Can you still see, can you see the presentation now? Is that working?
Yes, we can see it.
Excellent. Okay, I'll just leave it sharing the desktop then. So picking a good reference frame is important because all of the alignment that is being done to all the other frames is based on that one good reference frame. The software is saying, okay, the reference frame is how it's supposed to look. And I want to make all the other frames look like the reference frame. So it's important that you pick a good one. That's why I like AUTOSTAKKER, because AUTOSTAKKER will find that best, what it thinks is the best reference frame for you automatically. I usually start using that auto feature to add the alignment points, and then as I showed you in the demo, manually add additional points to key features. If you have poor quality image data, or if you have low contrast in your image, so the features are not well defined, you may have better results using fewer alignment points that you manually place. So there can be a little bit of trial and error depending on your image data. There are quite a few features in Registax and AUTOSTAKKER that I haven't experimented with. You're more than welcome to try them out and let me know how they work. I aim to have at least 100 frames stacked as a minimum. 250 is more like where I'd like to be, and that has to do with noise. The more frames you stack, the more you're going to deal with the noisiness of the image. Now, this does affect your capture size, because if your data quality, like in the example I just showed you, was quite poor, then to get, if we only could save 10% of the frames, then to get 250 frames, we need a 2,500 frame video. So you have to kind of keep that in mind. If it's a really awful day, you're going to need to collect more frames to be able to get the amount of good frames that you need to have a good stack. So the final step, or the nearly final step after the stacking, is something called wavelets. So it's a layered approach to sharpening your image. It breaks down sharpness in your image based on the size of the feature. There aren't really any rules. It's really up to the user what you think looks good. So it's a lot of just playing with the dials to see what you get. If you go too crazy on the use of wavelets, you will get a lot of noise and artifacts, and I'll show you what that looks like in a sec. Personally, I like linear Gaussian, and you'll know what this means when I show you Registrax in a sec. Linear Gaussian linked for most targets when the seeing is good, and when the stack size is large so that the noise of the image is low. If I'm at high magnification, or the seeing is poor, or if I have a lot of noise, then dyadic Gaussian unlinked works better. And again, I'll show you what that means in a sec. I rarely use more than 2 levels of wavelets, and we'll bounce over to a demonstration now. So Registack 6. Now you can use the select feature, or you can just drag and drop the image in. That works as well. So here is our image that we just stacked a moment ago. And here are the controls over on the right, or sorry, the left for the wavelets. So right now the default is linear Gaussian. And that has to do with the mathematical model that is being used by the software to do the sharpening. You don't really need to know how it works. You just need to know what it does to the image. So most of the time, as I said, I use linear Gaussian, and then I check this box here, for linked wavelets. So that means these layers here, layer 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, it's linking them together. So one amplifies the other, amplifies the other. They sort of build on each other, where if you were unlinked, then what you do to one layer does not affect the other layer. So the extent of the impact of the wavelet setting is less. Anyway, let's see what happens if I slide up the slider here on layer number 1. Now it defaults to just a portion of the image to start. You can left click anywhere you want on the image to move that test area around. So I'm just going to move it over the sunspots because that's my area of interest. And you can see, sure, it's sharper, but it's also a lot noisier. So there's a little denoise column here that I can adjust the number up.
Jim, I hate to interrupt, but it's at 7:30.
Okay, I can quickly wrap this up then. So like I said, you can play with these dials. The more that you play with them, you'll find what works best for you. And the end result is really what you like best. So I'll kill that and go back to the presentation, and we are almost finished anyways.
I have one question. I'm not sure how long it will take you to answer it. But
I think I'm almost done. I have 2 more slides, I believe, and then I'll quickly answer any questions. So all the sharpening, I use Registacks because it's quite powerful. You can do some other things like correcting your white balance or adjusting your histogram, but I more often do that outside. There's no rules. You can do whatever you think looks good. And it usually is a good idea to do a final pass in your image editing software to correct the histogram and do other things to really make your images pop. There's also noise reduction software available if you're pushing your wavelets a bit too much. Neat Image is a good free software for doing that. So conclusions, I get a lot of enjoyment out of solar system imaging. The investment of time and money can be small to get started and still be successful. There are a lot of people out there that are doing this as a hobby, so there's lots of people you can ask advice of. And at the end of the day, have fun. It's really just for our enjoyment, so don't get too stressed out about it. All right, that is it.
good advice. Peter asks, the Hubble had to originally deconvolve to fix images. Is what you're doing similar?
It is similar, yes. The deconvolution is one algorithm for detecting edges and processing them to sharpen the edges to improve the quality of the image. And wavelets is a similar, it's not exactly the same mathematically, but it's a similar idea, yeah.
Tom asks, so our final question, Tom asks, does Topaz denoise any application?
I have not used Topaz. Jim Sophia has, and he's had really good results with it. It has both denoising and sharpening tools in it. I don't know if Jim, you want to pop in and talk about that?
Yeah, it actually has a variety of filters that you could use, one of them being denoise, but it also has precision detail filters that really allow you to bring out the detail as well. And of course, adjust the exposure, the brightness, the histogram. And it's very easy to use. You can choose whichever filter you want to employ, and you could turn it on and off. So you can see whether the image is improved or not from the filters you use. So I would strongly recommend it. I find it very helpful.
Thanks, Jim. Two Jims. Thanks, Jims and Jims.